Welcome to Cornell University. This is just somewhat of a summary, if you will, reflection on what we've learned about apologetics. Excuse me. In researching apologetics, I went back to hermeneutics. I and a colleague, Eddie Johnson, for example, we went to seminary together, Missionary Baptist Seminary in Little Rock, Arkansas. So we went back to our hermeneutics professor, and there he was, all these years later, still working, laboring in word and doctrine. So he encouraged us to engage hermeneutics. That is, he was supportive of our effort, which was to quantify the hermeneutic process that we had, according to which he had taught us hermeneutics, and he was willing to go through the arduous process, if you will, of being interviewed, and he gave us generous feedback, and so we compiled that. And what I did was make it an element in a research I'm doing for work through Louisiana Baptist University's PhD program in biblical psychology. Dr. Mark Crook is the head of that psychology department. He is very supportive, encouraging. He also serves as a vice president of the university and theological seminary. So, with Dr. Mark Crook's encouragement and his oversight of the program, which gives me a lot of liberty to really study this out as far as I can, and I'm coming now to closure on the gathering of the data, but went back to the hermeneutic upon which apologetics is based, and how is that related to biblical psychology, for example, the nouthetic counseling by J. Adams, quite an established psychologist among Christian psychology. William James, a theological professor of Harvard University who developed psychology as one of the leading foundations of Christian psychology, I suppose we would say. And so working on all that, I learned in nouthetic counseling, nouthetic was to mentally place or position someone. So that's a function of the scriptures as we're scripted, as we're discipled. So I noticed in apologetics there was quite a large amount, let's say, of conflict and friction. It appeared to be animosity, unlimited. So about apologetics, do apologetics always arouse animosity? Well, seemingly so in situations where we noticed and where I've been able to observe, especially with all the feedback, it appears that we all have a desire for what we were primed, whatever it was. Let's say we're primed according to some fallible eschatological construct, whether it be pre-trib, mid-trib, post-trib, or pre-wrath. It appears that all adherents to one of those options, and I'm certain there's more out there, all seem to present initially some of the same aversion, or even they retaliate emotionally. They seem to be more prepared to retaliate rather than to give an answer. So that demonstrates that it's a highly emotional, affective side that was primed, and that they did not really place a lot of investment or make a lot of investment of the cognitive side in understanding the rationale for their belief. Now, in such things such as pre, mid, or post-trib, no one has presented any consequence of harm. That is, a lot of people rather take a who cares, a pan trib, as one man said, it'll just all pan out. Well, they just would rather sit on the sideline than use it as a test of fellowship, which appears to be a tendency, a us versus them, which is a contradiction of a Christian community of brethren collaborating together. So capturing all this, I've certainly become aware of the strong aversion to apologetics, because A professional apologetics has nothing to do with the subject, for example. So people who make it rise to the level of the Supreme Court, for example, use a hermeneutic, a systematic interpretation of documents. They're known as constructionist or textualist. And they're also called labeled conservative, which is very inappropriate. It has to do with academic integrity and how to handle a text so that what you say today reflects what they wrote then. Well, that's true even in apologetics. The foundation of it is hermeneutics, so there's still a strong aversion toward what a text actually says. So if you are a constructionist, a textualist, a contextualist, then your apologetics will reflect the irrefutable and well, it's indisputable. That is, it's without challenge. Your answers will reflect the text, and no one will be able to overcome it or overturn it, to use legal jargon. So there seems to be a strong aversion for such definitive expressions. So curious as I was, and as a pastor, and knowing so many pastors of the Lord's churches that labor in word and doctrine, we have an advantage, for our ultimate documents are still here with us. We have extant copies of Greek and Hebrew text. We have extant copies of even the translations upon which we now know the King James, the final compilation of those, which we don't have to admire the motive of the king. He might have meant it for ill, but God used it for good. We don't have to admire when he authorized his version that he then effectively criminalized everyone else's. We don't have to be embittered by it. It's now all historical fact. We weren't the ones there. Of course, it was our faith, and we, in that sense, were bleeding and being persecuted. And of course, we came to this country, and our founders, you can look in the history and on the murals in Washington, D.C., the Geneva Bible. And of course, the content of the Geneva Bible is in the King James Version. And the majority of that book is a compilation of established translations, all from a line of text that can historically be traced back, showing the faithfulness of people guarding it. But apologetics seems to be a field that finds a great aversion in that animosity seems to abide in the hearts of those who have an emotional investment. That is, they were simply primed by statements that, well, can you believe people aren't pre-trib? Or can you believe those people are post-trib? And it's almost peer pressure rather than positing from a text. Well, when we demonstrated that pre, mid, post, and pre-wrath are all fallible constructs, all dependent upon something that is impossible in the Bible, and that is, it's impossible to sever the seas away, that is what we call the rapture from the resurrection, which will not occur until Jesus returns, and the resurrection and rapture occur simultaneously. But the Bible demonstrates that God's people, specifically his churches in Revelation, come out from Great Tribulation. That's our Exodus. Great works are online and available. Most pastors of the New Testament churches, as we identify ourselves according to that, can tell you that we have correlated before and are aware of the correlation between the Exodus of the Old Testament and the types and what actually occurred historically in Egypt through plagues and conflict and how they exited, and our Exodus in Revelation. There are direct correlations with those plagues and judgments. Matter of fact, even Egypt is used as a description of the conflict there, the Jerusalem area, and it's called Sodom and Egypt. And of course, we know the first to betray. Our Old Testament types show God's people going away and being unfaithful, and we saw them being unfaithful in the arrival of Jesus, where his own people refused to receive him. And there's characterological depictions in the book of Revelation. But again, back to What's the aversion? Uh, well, it appears that if you don't pick sides among these fallible constructs, this is where we really are seizing this, and we will not back away from this. We will not apologize, that is, say we're sorry for demonstrating that we can uh, prove the literal days of the 6-day creation where God prepared the earth for man and made it habitable. We can prove where and why the earth came to be without form and void, that it was not bara, created without form and void, but it was haya, came to be without form and void. And that fact, those are facts that bothers people who don't adhere to a hermeneutic and don't have an apologetic that corresponds with the holistic approach where we include all the Bible. We don't find any verses that we would care to remove. Genesis 1:1, we can demonstrate absolutely instant and spoken creation. We've proven 360-day year, which is taught in Genesis. Noah, you can go there and look at that. We prove that just an elementary level of arithmetic you can depict in symbols, just very small symbols. 1 over infinity equals 0. You say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, let's say infinity refers to the infinite power of God, and this 1 up here is the event of creation. So God instantly and without any time created heaven and the earth perfectly, without fault, it was formed perfectly. It was not empty or void. It was perfect. It would certainly been something to observe. And we demonstrated that from Genesis 1:1 and then John 1:1, the eternality of the Word who was already being there. We demonstrated and demarcated between in beginning creation as opposed to in time creation of Genesis 2:4. We showed that if a person takes the 360-day calendar that the Bible teaches in Genesis, that you can prove the prophecy of Daniel between March 14th, 445 BC and April 6th, 32 AD, that time period is the same number as 483 prophetic years times 360 days, and both of those equal 173,880 days to the day. So we have irrefutable evidence of that demonstration. We also proved that on the 6th day, Adam, the man Adam, was completely formed when God created him, so that in one day, a regular day, if we're talking about daylight, 12 hours, so he could have been created as quickly there as 12 hours and been 30 years old. That's called relativity. We demonstrated the Bible 1 day to 1,000 years. We demonstrated that by doing simple arithmetic. Simple arithmetic, as Leonardo da Vinci would say, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And we noticed in apologetics that language-based is very much a leader in simplicity, and it is unsurpassed in its sophistication. And we agree with Albert Einstein, who was aware of biblical Hebrew and the knowledge that he had of invariance of light and the instant and spoken creation event. We know he was aware of relativity, knowing of the Hebrew as a Jewish person. He knew of relativity of 1 day as 1,000 years. He knew of the teachings of Moses. He said that when someone can't explain something simply, it's because they don't understand it well enough. So we demonstrated simply how a person can take 12,500 years times 360-day year, gives them 4.5 million days. When multiplied by 1,000 years, just add 3 zeros to a million and change days to years, and you have 4.5 billion years. So we demonstrated that the knowledge of relativity is precursive to centuries later, that is 1900 years before Einstein. Relativity was taught by Peter, 2 Peter 3:8, I believe, where he, in a New Testament account, which is not the psalm or poetry genre, he was teaching the lesson that Moses was singing about in Psalm 90, and he taught them to understand how time actually works. We demonstrated the decay rate of 1,000-year lifespan to 100 years today. Genesis 6:3 talked about 120 years where God said his spirit would not always strive with man. And some have said that's not a lifespan, and that's fine. I wouldn't completely rule it in nor completely rule it out, but we demonstrated that if you took the 180 years there and then the 80 years in Psalm 90, that's an average of 100 years, and we know people don't live 100 years, and those who do demonstrate it so exceptional that it proves the rule. So we have that, and we showed that elaborate decay rate. We cited the sources that have even been studied by geneticists and been observed by other fields of study. So we really enjoyed apologetics. It's very disappointing the few people who have taken issue and expressed animosity. It was already there, though, as I and our colleagues encourage one another to remember that, when we teach, we might trigger something, but we didn't load it. For example, we might have pulled a trigger, but we didn't load that, and we might have tipped something over, and a lot of toxins flowed, but we didn't feel it. So a lot of us carry baggage. A lot of us build up things. People are primed, and some people make a large investment in fallible constructs. So when we do apologetics, it's based upon hermeneutics. When we, as I'm doing, is demonstrating nouthetic. A nouthetic approach is to mentally position someone and not leave them dangling on the prongs of these two-horned or three-horned dilemmas out there. Leaving people in a flummox is not compassion. It's not the Spirit of Christ. It's not what Jesus would do. We don't ask what would Jesus do. We do what Jesus did. We observe what Jesus did. We know what Jesus did. We know what he taught. We, by apologetics and then using it in the approach of compassion through counseling as pastors or counselors, we as colleagues are working together, and we have met with several subject matter experts, scholars in the field, pastors, the highest level of scholarship that a person can demonstrate. But we're working now to continue to keep our answers very concise and precise. We were advised by our psychology professor from the Missionary Baptist Seminary in Pastoral Counseling, Brother John Penn, to make it concise where someone can start and finish and grasp it without it just drifting. He taught us to watch out for project creep, where we start working on something and it just becomes voluminous. So he has a heart of compassion that he didn't mind disclosing to us. All the pastors we're working with, especially in the American Baptist Association, communicating with through the American Baptist Association Preachers Forum on social media, are collaborating and reasoning together to help encourage people. For example, in controversies about Bible translations, we've helped people understand, for example, the King James Version is the last version upon which the Lord's churches have their blood spilled. The persecution associated with Bibles throughout the histories, the great English Bibles, for example, that brought the Western world as we know it, Western civilization into existence, we teach and demonstrate that that is a preservation of inspiration so that we don't fall into that, is it inspired or not-ism. That's just a low, underdeveloped discussion that creates an unnecessary dilemma. We can love our Bibles just like we love our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, our Bills of Rights, our sacred documents that are products of that. We can know our history of defending the freedom of conscience, thought, and speech. We can admire the pilgrims that came here with their Geneva Bibles that were outlawed when the King James Bible was authorized. We don't have to take issue with each other, which would be a contradiction, knowing the issues that were taken. We can look back at our history, unbroken saga of the scripts, if you will. We can see the unbroken history of the Lord's churches as they prevailed. As Jesus said, the Lord, his church would prevail. The gates of Hades would not prevail. So Lord's churches are prevalent. So it's very much compassionate, and apologetics where you have the heart for it. It's not near as difficult, and then you can see why you don't want to leave people dangling in a dilemma or invite them into a flummox. People need a quiet, peaceable life, not a "Are you young earth or old earth? If you pick the wrong one, you'll be punished." That's pressure, and that's actually the definition of persecution. So whether it's social pressure, coercive power, all those types of things, they're quite irrelevant to what we're doing as pastors in the Lord's churches, and it's quite irrelevant to how prevalent the Lord's churches are, because we are in New Covenant churches, so we live with the interest of one another in the church. Husbands live with the interest of their wives, wives live with the interest of their husbands, children with the interest of their parents, parents with the interest of their children, brothers in the New Covenant live with the interest of their brother, and sisters likewise, and all of us are living collectively in New Covenant relationship with the interest of Christ. So that can't be prevailed. Love always wins. We're here to make disciples for Christ, and that's through preaching the gospel. If you add anything to Jesus, so Jesus plus anything is another Jesus. It's a different gospel, different spirit. If you add anything to faith, the faith of Christ, faith plus something upon which we're declared right, justified, that's not faith. It's certainly not the faith of Jesus. He was faithful unto death, even death the cross. He was perfect, sinless, without blemish. So apologetics, when what we've learned is we've aroused a lot of animosity. Now, we didn't plant that animosity. We did not cause it. What happens when we preach, when we teach, when we solve these things that have become almost riddles? People are almost overly invested in sustaining these flummoxes and these fallible constructs, and we separate and distinguish fallible religious constructs from the Holy Bible. And this is a great work of compassion. It's what the Lord's churches do. And in the purview of the program I'm currently in personally at Louisiana Baptist University, it's been very much a growth experience to learn just how large a footprint compassion can be, and a willingness to suffer reproaches by both sides in fallible constructs or conflicts that are based on fallible constructs. It's a worthy reproach. Thankful for it. Eddie Johnson, president of Cornell University, he's grateful to be involved. All of the pastors that have helped us, feedback to us, collaborate with us. We notice there are people who aren't interested in collaboration. We don't have a problem with that. They're into us versus themism. They don't. They have an aversion to Christian community. They're always, out to negate something, and we're encouraging people to evaluate and then define, document, and disclose fallible elements in a fallible construct. And then to remember that the Bible is a living message. It's a living word. It teaches us. And there are people who have been here on the earth since the days of Christ, living out and following Him. So it's quite an interesting story. I'm glad to be coming to a conclusion and closure in this work that I have been doing. And these colleagues have been gracious. And certainly it's been a joy to reconnect with former professors, connect again, and also connect anew with people and great resources, men of great compassion who want people to understand the true value of what Christ has made available to us and has favored us to enjoy. So apologetics always arouses animosity, and if you're willing to bear the reproach that belongs to Christ, you're willing to let that reproach against Christ fall upon you, then you too can understand the joy, the cause or base of gladness to know that you're relieving other people from that suffering, and it's unnecessary that they should ever be ridiculed and labeled, if you will, as a young earther or an old earther, or that they're criticized because someone calls them a gap theorist or a non-gap theorist, or if someone says it's laughable to believe in literal days. We've demonstrated it irrefutably. We've demonstrated what the gospel says irrefutably. We've demonstrated the importance and significance and the liberty of even participating in baptism through New Testament churches, by New Testament churches. So there's no downside except for those who have an investment in something less than what God's called us to do. And we're thankful to be on the leading on this apologetics that is language-based. It's unsurpassed, and it's especially it can't be improved upon because those who are participating are pastors, retired pastors, men who've labored in word of doctrine, have given their lives to the Word of God and to prayer. We're collaborating, and yes, as brethren, we sometimes talk to each other the way brothers can talk to each other. But it's iron sharpening iron, and there'll always be a frictive element of that. But the value of our swords being sharp is for God's glory and for our fellow man's good, especially those that we're pastor and the sheep that we're feeding and the flocks that we're overseeing. So you have a blessed day, and don't be disappointed if when you do apologetics it always arouses animosity. It needs to come out. It needs to come to the surface. It needs to be processed. And sometimes people need to vent, and that's hard because if you're not careful, you'll take it personally and forget you're an ambassador for Christ. We stand in His place, calling men to be reconciled to God as though Christ Himself were calling them to do that. So you have a blessed day, and don't be alarmed about apologetics always arousing animosity.